I mean, by now, I guess everyone in the industry should be aware of the EU battery regulation. Um, but in case they've kind of just entered the industry or for whatever reason haven't been following it, kind of either you can give like a very basic overview of what it is, who it applies to, and I guess, yeah, how ready you think the industry is for it.
Yeah, so I can start by giving a bit of an overview based on what we see at Infyos, working with different battery energy storage developers, battery energy storage manufacturers across UK, Europe, and globally. And so the EU battery regulation came into force in August 2023 and was put into force to replace the previous EU battery directive. The goal of the regulation generally is to set a standard framework to ensure that batteries placed into the EU market or into service in the EU are both safe and sustainable. So, to solve for a lot of the public and industry pushback around battery safety, things like fire safety, health and safety being major issues. And then from a sustainability point of view, solving for the reality of what actually goes into a battery is a complex set of raw material being mined in some of the highest risk regions in the world, and then being processed, refined, midstream manufacturing and cell
Mm.
manufacturing, majority about 70-80% of that happening in China, which naturally from a geopolitical point of view comes with its own risks, but also from a sustainability point of view, whether that's looking at energy challenges that you have with how energy intensive the refining process is for batteries, and then how so much of that energy is coming from coal energy sources, through to the human rights challenges that you have at the raw material mining stage or at the refining stage. And so this regulation effectively, rather than every developer and every manufacturer coming up with their own policy processes in order to manage for safety and sustainability, what this regulation is allowing the industry to do is to set a standard for how every BESS manufacturer should be approaching the battery safety and sustainability question. And interestingly, what we therefore also see is that it's somewhat becoming this voluntary global standard for how even developers in the UK and manufacturers selling into the UK are addressing these sustainability challenges.
Awesome. I'm just gonna jump in here with Sarah. That's a great summary. The thing that I suppose from my perspective, and I look at it as a lawyer, and it's sort of perhaps a very forensic business perspective coming at it from a legal contract perspective. I think what is really interesting with this is the transparency element and the move and the shift change in the way in which we need to approach this industry away from just a profit-driven industry to ones where we focus on ESG more broadly. And I think that for me is one of the most exciting things that I see play out in the industry from when it originally started. So the second key aspect of the battery regulations, which I find quite critical for a number of contracts that I look at, largely relate to the recycling aspects and exactly who is going to bear the costs in relation to recycling. And this is quite topical because there is and I'm getting super legal and geeky here, apologies, but there's an EPC element, there's an LTSA element, and you're looking at long-term contracts. And the industry is just moved on so much in 10 years. And how is this going to change in 15, in 20? And we are almost trying to future-proof something. And I think that is equally exciting, but also a challenge. And so this is really pushing us into a realm of innovation, whilst also allowing us to focus and shift change in the way in which we think about things, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd say I'd add to that as well. I think alongside that kind of shift in transparency, and particularly related to your question, Cam, on how actually ready is the industry, I think one of the most interesting things that we see doing due diligence across all of these tier one to tier two and beyond BESS manufacturers is that when you do ESG and regulation due diligence, you find that even for the tier one manufacturers, there's actually huge variance in how ready they are for the regulations. So the requirements are coming in at staggered intervals. So far, for example, this year we've had extended producer responsibility requirements. Next year, there's product carbon footprint requirements coming in February. The following year, there's due diligence and battery passport requirements and so on. But even if we are to look at the regulation requirements coming into place in the next few months, so product carbon footprint, according to our data at Infyos, less than half of the industry currently has verifiable data to prove that they are compliant with that requirement coming into place in 3 months' time. And so what that means is you have the majority of the industry in this racing to get ready for these regulations. And so I think this kind of, to your point on transparency, I think one of the big shifts that we see is there used to be a kind of, what we don't know doesn't hurt us. Let's not ask and hope that it's regulation. Surely everybody knows regulation and is ready. Whereas actually, when you dig into the data, what you see is that this regulation is exceptionally complex for BESS manufacturers to meet because there's so many different requirements. And with each of those requirements, there's different supporting guidelines on how to actually implement it. And therefore, we can't just assume that your supplier signs the contract saying, yes, we will comply with all regulations in our jurisdiction, and that therefore means that they are definitely going to be ready for this regulation coming into place. And I think that fits into this sense of driving for more transparency. The challenge is that increasing transparency in an industry that hasn't typically been transparent is difficult, and it is going to mean that there are some suppliers that are less ready.
Absolutely. Cam, I wonder whether it's helpful for me to just give a high-level overview of the application of the regulations. Do you think that would be helpful?
Yeah, sure.
So just in terms of just building on what Sarah's talked about, the 2023 regs, the 2006 regs, and man, this is super important for lawyers. And just because of the way in which your contractual commercial terms will play out in contracts. And what do these regs actually deal with? So the EU battery regulation, the 2023, fully replaced the old directive, the 2006 one. And the key trigger date is the 18th of August, 2025. So very, very recently. And this is the massive shift change that Sarah's just talked about in the context of sustainability, circularity, transparency, all of that good stuff that we've talked about. And it really applies to all battery types. So it's really broad. And the key for us as lawyers, or those of us listening, is to do with the enhanced obligations for producers, once again, for all categories of batteries. And that's what we will be talking about more and more during the course of this discussions today. So producers must now take back waste batteries of all shapes, sizes, and chemistries and bear full responsibility for collection, treatment, and recycling. That is like humongous. That is a huge shift change in approach. Why do I say it's a shift change in approach? Because this is an EU approach. The UK is still within the 2006 directive, where there is a possibility of financing arrangements that developers can enter into with OEMs in order to share costs of batteries for recycling, treatment, collection, etc. In the EMEA, so the European context, that is a shift change. And this is a very different approach being expected of battery OEMs in that EU context. So there is almost a divergence in approach between what is happening in the UK right now and what is now going to happen in EU. And as Sarah's talked about as well, I think there is going to be some systematization or some uniformity in the way in which we're going to see perhaps approaches aligned. So if you have a battery OEM operating in EU and UK, I would imagine that they'd want to impose the same kind of, I suppose, facilities available for recycling across the board from a reputational perspective, from a business perspective. But it's going to be an exciting and interesting space for us to look into, I think. Sarah, I wonder whether you had any further things to add to this.
I think at the general level, I think you've covered the major things on I think one of the big questions we get is who it applies to. And I think that question of it applies to whoever is producing the battery and putting that battery onto the European market or into service. And I think the interesting thing from a battery energy storage industry perspective is then most of the time what we therefore see is that it's the suppliers, the integrators, that are often responsible for ensuring compliance. And the BESS developers themselves aren't necessarily under the regulation. However, what we see is that are huge consequences of the BESS developers not having the right processes in place to ensure that they're collecting or they're working with a supplier that is ready. So, that's everything from the risk of, if that BESS manufacturer isn't meeting the regulation, then they can get blocked from the European market potentially. And so that then means block shipments, that means supply chain delays. Supply chain delays means project overruns. Then you get into, I guess, comes back to the legal of, well, who was legally liable? Have there been contract loopholes that allow the supplier to try and push some of that liability onto the developer? And so that in turn can then end up being a kind of a legal battle alongside increased system costs. And all of that comes back to the developer to mean potential lost revenue. And that lost revenue puts their financing at risk. And so all of that loops together to mean that what in practice we see is increasing focus from financing on how are the developers genuinely ensuring that their BESS manufacturers that they're selecting for their projects are in line with these EU battery regulation requirements.
Yeah, because even if they don't fall under it themselves as developers, there's a lot of risk for them if their suppliers they're locked into, don't comply.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. Cam, on that particular point that you just mentioned, we've seen like legal advice where we've had to provide, where we look at are you placing the battery in the UK market? Are you a producer? Are you as the developer? Can you be classified as one? Is the main contractor the producer under the regulations? If it's a full wrap EPC, they could be, particularly if the OEM has no base or a company organized in the UK and they're importing it. If the main EPC contractor is the entity importing it on behalf of the client. So who is actually placing the battery in the UK market? That proves to be quite an interesting question. And the same would apply in the EU context as well. But in the EU context, there is a requirement for producers to be registered in EU member states, I believe. And therefore, I think you will have perhaps a more organized system in which the industry will move towards. And I'd imagine soon most OEMs will be registered in most countries in which they're going to operate. So I shall stop there.
Right. So just on that last bit, that would mean that so potentially there's a grey area in the UK about who's responsible, but in the EU, that should be less the case with these OEMs registering as like, I am the producer.
Correct. I think just goes back to, the market is maturing. I mean, the UK market is very mature. And I think it's just a question of how do you want to do business in a country? If you're operating in East Asia, invariably you would want to set up a company of some sort in the UK to deliver your projects. And so I think the market now is moving in that direction anyway, is what I'm saying. But in about 4 years ago, we were asked to produce legal opinions on who is the producer under the regulations, because is it developer, main contractor, or the battery OEM who is bringing in the battery? So that was an interesting question, but I think it's going to be less of an issue now. I think the markets are far more mature. Sarah, do you have any?
Yeah, so I was just going to, I guess, digging into that point that Cam was making a bit more. So it seems like in the European regulations, you effectively have much more kind of structure on who is responsible, and there can't be kind of a shifting of responsibility in the same way that what we see in the UK is it's less defined. And therefore, I guess from a legal and contracting perspective, what that then means in the UK under extended producer responsibilities is that the supplier can potentially try and get the developer to be responsible. And whereas in Europe, that would be not necessarily the case that they could do that.
We haven't really talked about due diligence and traceability, right? You touched on it, Sarah, but it'd be nice to kind of understand a little bit more about that. You said that was coming in 2 years, I think.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. It was supposed to come in August of this year. The
Right.
due
Okay.
diligence requirements were originally billed for August of this year. However, earlier this year, there was a proposal announced to push them back to August of 2027. There's a couple of reasons why that is. On one side, it's that in order to comply with these due diligence obligations, you needed to have a notified body ratifying your compliance, and half of the member states hadn't yet put those notified bodies in place. And so
Right.
fundamentally, it wasn't going to be possible to comply. And then there's a practical reality that traceability, which is one of the requirements, and a lot of the other requirements are exceptionally complex regulation requirements to be able to comply with. And whilst Europe wants to push the industry to be as safe and sustainable as possible, it also has to balance that with what's actually practically feasible in the industry and how do we make sure
Mm.
that we don't slow down the deployment of batteries and on our mission to kind of move towards net zero by having these types of regulations. And so I guess to break down the regulation requirements so that makes a bit more sense. So in the due diligence obligations, roughly speaking, you can see that the requirements are broken down into three main areas. You have the policy aspects of the requirements, which is the idea that you have to have a due diligence policy. That due diligence policy needs to be aligned with international standards like OECD. You have to have a document management system in place to hold that policy for a time period. You have to have third-party verification against the policy, top management responsibility. And so the policy itself, most large battery energy storage manufacturers have had some level of due diligence policy in place. Whether or not it meets all those fine details of requirements needs some adjustment. However, the supply chain due diligence processes that are under this regulation, a lot of these are new. So this is the idea that for high risk raw materials, you need to have supply chain traceability back to the raw material mining. And so for an LFP battery, for example, you need to know exactly the origins of where the lithium has been mined and how it's moved through the supply chain and be
Mm.
able to report on that. For other types of battery chemistries, other high risk materials are in scope, like cobalt, for example. Then the processes also require you to be cascading down due diligence clauses into your supplier contracts, have a grievance mechanism in place so that if there's any risks identified by anyone across the supply chain or in the wider public, that there's a way for them to raise this grievance and for this to be solved. And then also for the battery manufacturers to have a due diligence system in place that identifies and mitigates 15 specific ESG risks in line with OECD guidance or international standards. And so
Mm.
that's looking at identifying and mitigating risks such as forced labor, child labor, through to biodiversity, and so across the E, S, and G spectrum. And then you need to be able to report on an annual basis about your processes, the risks identified, and how you've remediated those, as well as being able to report to your downstream, i.e., the battery manufacturers being able to report to the customers on their progress. And so that kind of policy process reporting, things like traceability, you're starting from zero. That can take you well over 18 months to get that into place
Mm.
because you have to get, you might be the BESS integrator, but then you're buying from the cell manufacturer, and the cell manufacturer then has 40 different component suppliers. Then it's got each of those component suppliers then have materials going in, and then those materials go back to the raw materials. And so
Mm.
for the large manufacturers, where they're also producing multiple different cell types, each of those cell types, they'll have 40 components, but they might have, for their cathode, they might have 5 different suppliers they use for their cathode material. And so what that then means is you have this very complex supply chain network structure that if you're saying, okay, I want to know exactly where my raw material of lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel is, it's not just a quick call up one person and solve
Mm.
a problem. It takes months of building the relationships to get to get the data, and also navigating the huge challenges that exist around confidentiality and the commercial sensitivity of a lot of this data.
Right. But this again, this is falling on the producer, the one putting the battery into the market. Developers and operators, how do they need to think about this stuff?
Yeah, so really what we see is because there is huge variance in how ready the developers and the manufacturers are from a developer and operator point of view, you want to be doing as part of your supplier selection process, due diligence to understand can the best manufacturers I'm going to go into contracting with, do they have the systems in place to meet these requirements today? Or, for a regulation that's coming in 2027, it's okay potentially for them to have partial compliance with this regulation today, but do they have a clear roadmap and are they setting clear milestones that they're communicating on how they are going to close the gap to make sure that they are compliant? And so that's one side of it. And then I think the other side of it is irrespective of what actually the regulations are requiring, we're seeing increasing requirements from financing, irrespective of the regulations, to have requirements around traceability of high risk raw materials so that they can, irrespective of what the EU battery regulation requires, maybe it's forced labor prevention, or maybe it's they have an internal mandate where they need to access improved traceability data, they will put that in place. And so that then falls on the developers to make sure that they're selecting suppliers that can meet those investor requirements.
Yeah.
Should I just pick up on a few points that
Yeah,
Sarah's talking
absolutely.
about? So I find it amusing that they have called it the Omnibus 4 simplification package, which has pushed this. I always like stuff with the simplification package, but thankfully this time I think they got it right, because we need to get the systems in place which actually work, and having some extra time is likely a good thing. From my perspective, I think this is such when I was talking about the mindset shift, and this is like very cool when you're sitting and dealing with negotiations to actually be talking about these points, when previously it was only driven about, let's talk about liquidated damages, let's talk about caps on liability. And we now have entire sessions, hours talking on ESG, which I think is game changing within the industry personally, and I love it because you learn a lot about the practical aspects of supply chains, global politics. I'm not going to talk about Trump, but everything surrounding it. There's a lot of, extremely candid discussions which take place when you are dealing with these negotiations. The other thing which I find really interesting is this is not a let's just do it once, check a few boxes and it's done. Like, it's not a checkbox exercise anymore. It is a life cycle maintenance. You need to look at it over the long period of time. It is repeat factory visits. It is changes which you need to report on through time. And I think, Sarah, I'm sure you'll have a few things to say about that, but I think that's sort of quite challenging for a lot of OEMs entering the market to have that future focused 10-year, 15-year, 20-year sort of view ahead on how are they going to report on these things in a very changing global political scenario, as well as from a pricing perspective. And exactly like Sarah said, a lot of these discussions I find quite interesting because there is a OEM approach where they clearly know, and I think, Sarah, it would be helpful to hear you talk about the battery passport side of it as well, and at least as an update, because I think that is quite relevant. But there is an OEM approach where you have these system-based, the setup from a policy perspective, because it's really great for them to publicize their traceability sort of statistics, traceability related information. So you have all of them publishing this online publicly, or even disclosing it in a meeting, when we have these negotiations. But then you have the key stakeholder who is influencing this decision. Unless you have that key stakeholder, usually a financing party, who imposes a requirement on the OEM to disclose this information, I don't see this happening as the norm even. I reckon in the EU it will start becoming the norm, but it's still something which is now needs an external stakeholder imposing this requirement from a contractual basis. It's very easy to perhaps have it as part of a schedule within a document lost somewhere, but to actually have core clauses dealing with you will need to allow us to visit your factories, allow us to sort of inspect your quality control mechanisms, your ESG sort of traceability supply chain sort of systems in place. That is kind of game changing. And a big part of this for me is the confidentiality piece that Sarah talked about, the NDAs that sit behind it, because this has a huge impact on price, which in a market where taking lithium ion, the price fluctuates and competition is quite severe. I think having something which is on the ESG side coming in, which will influence where you're buying your products, how are you doing it, will naturally influence price. So for me, that tension that exists between the commercial aspects and the regulatory aspects is something which I'm seeing more and more play out in the contractual side.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think on the point around, is this a one-off exercise or is this an ongoing piece of work? I think that's where we've also in the last 5 years seen a big shift between okay, let's ask some questions at the point of supplier selection around ESG, like maybe traceability, but unlikely at the time, maybe regulation compliance in detail, but mostly just, do you comply with these regulations? And it's very much seen as a tick box exercise. Yes, we asked a few questions. They tick the box saying, yes, we've got this all into place, and we kind of dug no further to as what has been around for a long time but hasn't necessarily been adopted in the battery energy storage industry is the OECD due diligence guidance, which effectively what it says is in order to be aligned with their international standard of how to really due diligence your supply chain, you need to first set your policy of this is how we will approach due diligence, this is where we will set red lines, this is how we will collaborate with suppliers and make sure that we are collaborating rather than being punitive against suppliers. And then it talks about, okay, so you need to assess the risk and identify where your ESG or regulation compliance risks are. But that's only really one step. What it then says you need to do is you need to then cease, prevent, or mitigate that risk. And then you need to have a system for ongoing monitoring of, okay, you said that you're going to, take these steps to mitigate against the risks we found for non-compliance, but actually, are you monitoring that those actions have been taking place? And then the next step is, are you then reporting on that? So are you reporting to your internal stakeholders? Are you reporting to your external stakeholders, such as investors, on this? And then how do you continue to cooperate with your suppliers to remediate any and monitor for risks? Because, okay, we signed a supplier contract today, and in 2 years' time is actually when the product's being delivered. And therefore, today they might look like they're compliant with regulations, but the due diligence requirements come into place in under 2 years. And then so when you get the products that are actually coming through the port, which is the point where they need to comply, you then have this risk of, if you've not continued to monitor that supplier, you potentially at the point where it matters most, have a supplier that's at risk of non-compliance. And so that is, definitely a big shift that we're seeing, that, other industries like automotive industry or fashion industry have been doing this for years and years. And I think because the renewable energy industry is obviously having a huge impact on lowering carbon emissions and therefore having a positive impact on that side, there is still amongst some people in industry this idea of, well, actually, we're lowering carbon emissions, so do we need to worry about all these other ESG and sustainability problems? Whereas what this regulation is saying is, we're having this radical transformation towards net zero of the energy system. We need to make sure we're doing this safely and sustainably as well, so that we don't replicate a lot of the challenges with oil and gas and human rights and ESG risks around that into this new energy system that we're building.
Be interested to know, can I just jump in with a question on, we've talked a lot about the requirements, but I suppose based on what you guys have seen with maybe the other industries that you just mentioned there, what are the penalties going to be for not following this stuff, and how rigorously do you think they'll be enforced? I know it's a very hard question because it's a huge body and this is in the future, but how hard-nosed do you think the EU kind of is going to be with not following these standards.
Suriya, happy to let you answer that. I can also share
It's a
as well.
really, really good question. I mean, you have to, first of all, you have to go through quite a number of stages, right? Like, so when you look at the scope of what an OEM will need to do, collection, treatment, recycling, that's quite a broad selection of items which sit within it. You start with the contract to start off with. So as I said before, in the EU context, there is the possibility of tying into your contract price the aspects of collection, treatment, and recycling. If you're able to do that, again, that's a question mark, a huge question mark, you're not non-compliant. In theory, obviously, please do take relevant legal advice here if you're listening to this. But in theory, it is possible that you're entirely compliant with the regulations. In certain instances, I see OEMs including, and like I said, an open book mechanism which deals with such costs which sit outside the contract price, but with statements which say, well, for now, we're not able to cost it, but should we have to cost this at the relevant time with the information we have in the future, then we would do it on an open book basis with our developer client. So it's a very interesting way of building it into a contract price sort of reimbursement or adjustment for a future date. Now, whether that would hold up in law is questionable once more. So there are different ways in which we're going to find contracts being structured. There are instances, as I said, where I'm seeing provisions in a contract where we're saying we've all thought about it. We've all been advised properly by our relevant lawyers, and we have all agreed that this is the mechanism which works for all of us. And so then to potentially take a contract and take it to litigation or arbitration in the European context, you're going to have to deal with clauses which seem to suggest that everyone's had a chat about it. So if you've had a chat about it and you've agreed it commercially, does that breach the regulations? Probably does still. But again, so it's pretty complicated. So in theory, if you have a OEM failing to take back, I would assume a member state can take action against that particular OEM. Now, in practice, will that ever happen? What I'm seeing, a lot of OEMs have in-house mega policy teams. So they all have policy people running around working out how these EU regulations work. How do we remain compliant with it? And a lot of time and effort is going into that as well. So it would be a huge reputational risk for any OEM who would want to willfully fail this. I would assume so there would always be a deal done or a discussion had or a commercial contract being looked into. And I think so I'm not trying to, I hate sitting on the fence, but this is an area where I think it's almost inevitable that there are complexities in how we arrive at a given conclusion. But in theory, I'd imagine a member state could go, wait a minute, you're not doing what you should do and you're being contrary to the regulations, and that could be a problem. But I think that likelihood of that happening, at least with the big ones, big players, from a reputational side, is just non-existent, because they would not get themselves into that extremely awkward position. That would be my view. Sarah, I wonder whether you had any thoughts.
Yeah, I think from looking at it from two angles. One is, is there a risk that there will be major manufacturers non-compliant? I think there are huge policy teams inside these manufacturers. There are a lot of policies and regulations that these policy teams are focusing on beyond just the EU battery regulation, everything from cyber regulation to new AI acts to so on and so forth. And so the policy teams have to decide which regons to
Let's not forget fire safety as well. I'm just chucking that in.
Of course. And so from that point of view, on our side, and that's the policy and the regulation team, then they decide what has to be done. And then often there's actual processes that need to be followed through on, or policies that need to be designed, like whether that's, your traceability system, your due diligence system, your carbon footprinting. And that stuff I was saying earlier, because it's not just you as the company, it's you and your supply chain needs to act in order to be able to comply. And therefore, depending on the requirement, might take you 12 months, might take you 36 months to be able to comply. And so I think from that point of view, we see, and the data that we have on our side shows that there is a high risk that there's going to be major non-compliant suppliers out there. And then I guess the next level down is then like, well, so what? What happens if they're not compliant? And that's where, from an enforcement point of view, you have, are the regulators actually enforcing this? If you look in the US, somewhat equivalent regulations like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that has requirements around traceability and forced labor, they have been spending over $100 million a year on enforcement. Europe does not do that same budgetary allocation towards enforcement. And so generally speaking, from what we see at enforcement level, ends up being much more what Suriya said of, well, you end up voiding contracts, warranties if it's found that you're not compliant. That then creates, a business risk, and also, as Suriya was saying, a reputational risk of non-compliance. And then there's also generally what we tend to see, and you've seen this a little bit more focused so far on automotive, that rather than products getting blocked at port, what ends up happening is kind of more of a civil lawsuit, if that's the right terminology. Suriya, you'll have a better idea of the right terminology, where, say, a group of NGOs or a group of kind of legal activists or legal companies take certain companies to court based on them not complying with a regulation. And so you've seen this with the major automotive manufacturers in Germany, and also being called out the major Chinese battery manufacturers, of which many they're all supplying into BESS as well, also getting taken to court in Germany for non-compliance. And so, but that is I guess that's a different type of structure of penalty. That's taking the company to court rather than what the EU battery regulation is proposing, and what we see in the US under the Forced Labor Prevention Act is blocking products at ports. And then that impoundment and the impacts of that impoundment.
Cam, I just want to jump in to say, actually, just as a major highlight, this is the EU market we're talking about, not the UK market. And that's really important to note. And the EU market has different jurisdictions. So I would love to say I transcend every jurisdiction, but I don't. I'm a lawyer in England and Wales with a lot of, or not a lot of, but reasonable enough information about what's happening in EMEA, because we do EMEA projects as well. But we always, in this scenario, would say you have to look at how a contract plays out in the German market as opposed to the Italian market, because there are a lot of local civil code variations which apply, and the way a German court would approach a contract is very different from the French, when, with regards to even funding strategies, lending strategies, are all fairly different across those jurisdictions. So it's not a one-size-fits-all answer from an enforcement perspective, and it's really important that anyone listening, if they are concerned, will need to have local jurisdictional advice in the relevant sort of member state. So I think that apart, there is essentially do you want me to talk, Cam, do you want me to talk more about generally what we're seeing in contracts, or what would you like me to say do you want me to speak to any particular topic on what I'm seeing play out?
Well, yeah, I'd be particularly interested in, since the EPR came in, like what the kind of impact has been since then, because that was in August, right, in the EU. What the change has been. And then also, I know we talked a lot about contracts, but I'm interested in whether you guys have any visibility on like what's happening with like actual end of life BESS projects. I know it's early days, the vast majority of capacity is just coming online like now, but I imagine there are some cases where batteries need to be recycled or dealt with for projects that have been online for 5, 6, 7 years. So it'd be interesting to see kind of what's happening there, because I guess that it's kind of a separate thing entirely to what we're discussing, but it is ultimately like the EU battery regulation is dealing with that's going to happen a lot more in the next 5, 10 years. So yeah, I guess the two things really.
So I can most certainly, Sarah, talk about like what am I seeing in in post-August, like contractually. And I think I would be repeating myself a little bit, but I can talk about that. But the answer is not very much. But as far as end of life is concerned, this is not something that we lawyers tend to see, because it's, unless you go into litigation, unless it goes down the route of you are not taking on this BESS sort of container. I'm not seeing that yet. And at least in our teams, we haven't seen that yet. So I think
it's
there is
going
a piece
smoothly
there.
then, basically, at least, because they're not involving the lawyers yet.
They're not yet.
There
but
haven't been
doesn't
any
mean
big
they're
fights
not.
yet.
That doesn't mean they're not doing deals. But but Sarah, you might have a view on this. But can I just actually add something which I think is going to be very controversial? But Cam, I'll leave that to you to decide whether you want to add it in or not. But in the EU market, apart from what I've just said on the jurisdictional issue, the bit I wanted to mention as well is and Sarah mentioned this as well, every OEM obviously has warranties that they provide. Now, in contracts, we often see approved subcontractors or suppliers. There can be more than one. Of course, there need to be more than one, because the industry is so sort of busy generally. And so when you talk about like traceability requirements, if you swap a given supplier in a contract, you're automatically having to deal with a different supplier and their traceability requirements. And where I'm going with this is, these OEMs have to give warranties, and often they give end-use warranties to the end user, right? Do you think, and this is just an open question, and I do not have the answer, and I'm not seeing this yet, what stops these OEMs warranting compliance with ESG through the warranties? Because those warranties deal with changing products through time. And if you, each year, when you extend your warranty, those warranty terms and conditions, the piece of paper given to an end user, are we going to see in the future warranting of ESG requirements, ability to go to those factories to investigate, to quality check? Is that something that the industry is going to see? We're not seeing that yet in these warranties, but it's just a very controversial point that I'm chucking out there going, is that possible?
Yeah, I think on end of life, like generally in practice, what we're seeing is that it was originally estimated that a battery maybe had a lifespan of 10 years. This was based on research from over 20 years ago. And so as batteries are now becoming a lot more mature in the market, what we're seeing is they're not getting to end of life at 10 years. Actually, there's a lot of estimates that batteries can get to end of life at 20 years. But the big, or even beyond, the big factors at play are really, how are you using those batteries? And so often what gets referred to in the kind of battery chemistry industry is talking about what is the state of health of the battery. And so that's effectively how much usable capacity in the battery is retained in the battery when it's charged. And so typically what you tend to see is that end of life threshold depends, or that state of health when the percentage hits a certain threshold depends on how it's getting used. So, for a high performance vehicle in an EV versus for an everyday EV, maybe you're talking about 70 to 80% state of health, and then it can no longer be used. When you're looking at battery energy storage, generally speaking, they don't have the same wear and tear that EVs have to go through of, quick charging, discharging, and so on. And so typically that's where you tend to get a bit more of a variation around 60-70% state of health is when they come to end of life. And so the reality is today we have very little batteries on energy storage at end of life. Where you do see end of life happening in very small quantities is mostly around replacement parts when there's malfunctions, and still that's a relatively small piece. I think the interesting conversation at the end of life phase for batteries is whether or not they can be reused or repurposed, or whether they have to go directly into recycling. And so especially what we're more seeing today is EVs that maybe hit the 80% state of health, no longer work, then getting repurposed into stationary energy storage. and then they still can have, you know, another potential 5-year time horizon or more, depending on how they're used, before they hit a state of health that means they aren't suitable for battery energy storage anymore. And so I think, yeah, kind of to Suriya's point there, is like the reality is that we're not, both because of the practical use, but also because the recycling technologies themselves, one, very limited in the UK. Most of the recycling capacity is in China today. And two, just because we don't have the demand for it, that we don't actually really have many live examples yet of batteries getting to end of life, and how these warranties are being navigated or contracts are being navigated, or how they're genuinely evidencing that they're complying with these end of life regulation requirements.
Yeah, well, I think the EU batteries regulation, and specifically the passport, should make it much, much easier to redeploy batteries end of life, because I think what Second Life companies say as a big challenge is not having the information about a battery, not knowing its history, not knowing who it was made by, not knowing its chemistry very well. And yeah, we haven't really discussed the passport too much, but basically it's going to provide all this information with a QR code, so you'll know exactly who made a battery, what's in it, which should make all of that much easier. Yeah, Second Life is an interesting space that we could probably have another hour call on, but
Absolutely.
maybe let's put that to one side for now.
Cam, can I
Unless
answer
you
the
want to
question?
add something, yeah.
No, just the question that you asked. So what am I seeing in contracts since August of 2025? Nothing much has changed, to be honest, because no one knows how to actually deal with it, and not many lawyers are actually alive to this point specifically. So it is a very niche area. Like ESG has traditionally not been a hot topic, or even recycling has not been a hot topic, and it's often a second-tier discussion. And it's now being pushed into the mainstream because of financing party, the attentions sort of from key stakeholders. So contractually, since August, you know, the same kind, we're seeing similar kind of approaches, which is we're thinking about it as a company. We need time to work out what the EU is planning to do. In the UK, as I said, it's much easier because the financing arrangement is possible. So cost share of end of life is possible. In the EU, I think there's going to be extremely varied practices until businesses determine how they want to deal with the risk as such. Now, that is essentially after taking over. So when you deal with a project after energization, you're looking at the project dealing with defects in any of the sort of battery BESS as such. And that is where, when I spoke about the warranties, that becomes relevant, is how are you sourcing the parts for repairing the existing asset, which is operational. And then end of life is what we're looking at much, much later. So the period from taking over or energization to end of life effectively is the critical period which we're talking about in respect of the regulations. When we deal with delivery of the BESS on site before that point in time, if there is a defect, it is the responsibility of the OEM to take back to kind of obviously replace it. That is more mainstream, meaning that is less controversial here. No one's disputing it. So it is just the post-energization period that is going to be really interesting to see what plays out. And I think that is where the combination of how the warranties play with contractual terms and end of life requirements is going to be really important. And that is where I see contractual provisions dealing with end of life in an EPC, a BSA, LTSA or O&M, but not within the actual warranties being provided by the battery OEMs, which I find fascinating. So that is an interesting space, really.
Okay. Anything to add on that, Sarah?
No, I think we've deep dived a lot on the end of life recycling. I feel like if people are listening in, they might just be like, okay, you guys are too nerdy on this topic. There is more I can add, but I will not add it.
The only other thing I think worth mentioning is we cannot forget the politics of Europe, which is when we talk about enforcement, etc. And as our previous chat, where I was talking about Delft having like a digital twin of the European grid system and the 800 billion euro investment going in up to 2050, energy storage is critical to it. So if you have a member state taking issue with a battery OEM supplying mega kit into Europe at a time when we have to transition, there is going to be a tension between delivery of this massive infrastructure change and the politics of the contract and recycling and all of that sort of good stuff that we've just been talking about. So I think that is going to be an interesting thing that plays out through the policy teams, and also, perhaps people picking up phone saying, what's going on? Sort this out. So that's just something I wanted to mention.
I think it's an interesting point, and I think particularly, I'm guessing this batteries regulation was maybe drawn up before it was really fully acknowledged how critical storage would be on the grid. Possibly also when everyone thought there'd be a much bigger European manufacturing space than there was.
Yeah.
That's just a guess, but I would imagine that's the case.
No, I think there 100% there was a dream that maybe by putting in a sustainability safety regulation in Europe, where we're known for loving sustainability and safety, that there would be encouragement of a local European market on the back of that. Whereas actually what's happened is the Chinese manufacturers have got their heads around it, race to make sure they understand it, and are some of the best prepared out there. And so, I think there's definitely something on that. I think the other thing I would wrap up on around like your question earlier of who's actually enforcing this, I think the reality of what we see as to why this matters to developers is it's financing. It's whether it's debt financing, equity financing, or you get to the asset sale point and there's deep financing due diligence on the risks in the asset. That's the point where this goes from a like, oh, nice to have, and maybe at some point we should make sure this is in place, but it's number 20 on the list of all the things I have to do, to okay, we're trying to raise however many hundreds of millions for our next project deployment, and it's blocked because we haven't got these systems in place, and then it's a race to get ready. And so I think that's where, for some developers, there is a approach of wait and see as our compliance strategy. And then there's the other developers that know this is going to come, this is going to matter, and we're going to have more optionality in our financing and more optionality in what suppliers we can work with if we put the systems in place to make sure we're ready for this regulation. And so when it comes to, even though it's a regulation requirement, really we see it equally, if not more important, as a financing requirement.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I guess maybe to wrap up on, I think I've had you guys for like 50 minutes now, so I think we can probably conclude it there because my head's about to explode. But no, it's been super interesting. No, it's I think the most useful conversations are the ones